The latest video game war is heating up tonight. Nintendo's Gamecube system is about to hit the stores.
The Nintendo Gamecube would launch in September of 2001 in Japan, and a launch in North America would follow in November. After successfully launching the Game Boy Advance in the spring and summer, all eyes were on Nintendo to see if their new system could live up to their past glory. It wouldn't be easy. The Japanese economy was in a slump. The United States of America had just experienced the worst terrorist attack in the country's history, and Sony had already been out on the market for over a year with the PlayStation 2. It would be the most difficult launch for Nintendo yet. This is the story of the Nintendo Gamecube, and in this part, we'll take a look at the launch of the system and the follow-up from its launch. The Nintendo Gamecube launched in North America on November 18th, 2001. It was priced at $199.99, and it came with a system, one controller, and the appropriate hookups. The system would launch with a total of 12 games. Nintendo published 2 titles for their new system, Luigi's Mansion and Wave Race Blue Storm. Nintendo's former rival Sega would release 2 titles at the launch after discontinuing their Dreamcast system earlier in the year. They would port Crazy Taxi to the system and bring a brand new exclusive to the GameCube in Super Monkey Ball. The biggest launch title would be Factor 5's Star Wars Rogue Squadron 2 Rogue Leader, an exclusive to the system. The game was an audio and visual treat, featuring 480p resolution and 5-channel surround sound, thanks to Dolby Pro Logic 2. The rest of the launch games would be rounded out with licensed titles and sports games. As far as quantity was concerned, the GameCube was definitely lacking. The PlayStation 2 had launched a year earlier with 30 titles, and had spent that year releasing more critically acclaimed games. The Xbox, which released a few days before the GameCube, launched with the same number of titles, but it also had a massive hit, Halo Combat Evolved. Nintendo's lineup wasn't too bad, but compared to what else was out there, it's hard to argue that Nintendo started off on the right foot. It was even smaller in Japan. Only 3 titles launched with the system in September, the 2 Nintendo published games, and Sega's Super Monkey Ball. While the quality of the games wasn't too bad, there just wasn't a killer app for the system. Just a few weeks after the launch, on December 2nd, Nintendo would release 2 new exclusives for the system. The first was a new IP, Pikmin, from the legendary game developer Shigeru Miyamoto. The second would go on to become the best-selling game on the GameCube, Super Smash Bros. Melee. Melee would create one of the biggest followings of any Nintendo game. The title would sell over 7 million units, and is still being played by major competitive fighting game tournaments to this day. Nintendo delayed the initial release of the GameCube by 2 weeks to ensure that they had an ample supply of systems. 700,000 GameCubes would be available for the launch, but what good is it to have a system that no one knows about? In North America, the GameCube would receive a $75 million ad campaign. This paled in comparison to Microsoft's marketing push for the Xbox, which came in at $500 million. Nintendo was somewhat struck by this. Microsoft began promoting the Xbox in retailers much earlier than game makers had done in the past. Nintendo would go so far as to reach out to retailers, asking why the Xbox would be promoted months before its launch. Nintendo's ad campaign was mostly used to highlight first and second-party Nintendo games. The campaign featured full-page ads in magazines, giant banners in malls, and even a Hollywood party featuring the biggest and brightest stars at the time. Of course, Nintendo also invested in television commercials as well. They're interesting. Ads would showcase games and would feature the GameCube's iconic shape. Microsoft was out to make their name known with the Xbox, and Nintendo struggled to match their marketing presence. Microsoft would have commercials on major networks, including ESPN and Comedy Central. They would have massive print ads, and even a promotion with Taco Bell. Microsoft's goal wasn't to completely snuff out its competition with the GameCube, but rather to snuff out all of its competition in the market. At the end of the day, it helped Microsoft establish a foot in the console market, and has stayed there to this day. After the North American launch of the GameCube, one final piece of Nintendo-related hardware would launch in 2001. On December 13th, Panasonic released the Panasonic Q. It was a game console with a similar design to the GameCube and even played GameCube games. The most notable difference was the included DVD player on the system. The system came about through a deal between Nintendo and Matsushita, the parent company for Panasonic. The system would launch at a retail price of 39,800 yen, or roughly $440 US. Despite its added features, the Panasonic Q was largely a failure. It sold only around 100,000 units and was never released outside of Japan. The biggest problem was the cost of the system. While having an all-in-one unit is convenient, the Panasonic Q ended up costing more than a separate GameCube and a DVD player. It would be discontinued in December of 2003, just 2 years after its release. Despite the strong competition, the GameCube would have a successful launch in North America, selling through most of its allotted stock. Nintendo was off to a decent start. What followed was probably the worst period for the GameCube, its first year drought. From January to August of 2002, the GameCube would only see a single first or second party exclusive come to the system, the M-rated horror title Eternal Darkness. Nintendo would also release the first ever first-party developed wireless controller for a game console, the Wavebird. The Wavebird was slightly larger than the original GameCube controller and lacked the rumble feature, but was completely wireless. Nintendo would see some support from third parties, notably an enhanced port of Sonic Adventure 2 and a remake of Capcom's hit Resident Evil. The lack of software was noticeable, and Nintendo would spend its time reminding the world to hold out hope for the titles coming soon. With the GameCube's launch behind them, much of Nintendo's staff would see a shakeup. Many high-level executives would retire or join different companies. The biggest was Hiroshi Yamauchi, the president of Nintendo. Yamauchi had been the president of Nintendo since 1949 at the young age of 22. Yamauchi would completely change Nintendo as a company during his 53-year reign as president, transforming them from a small toy company in Japan to a global leader in the video game market. Yamauchi had been planning his retirement for a while, and had picked his successor, Satoru Iwata. Iwata had joined Nintendo in 2000 as the head of its corporate planning division, as well as sitting on the board of directors. Iwata had made a name for himself, previously as the president of HAL Laboratories. Iwata would become the company's fourth president, and the first not to be related to the Yamauchi family by marriage or blood. Iwata's leadership style was very different from that of his predecessors. He started by meeting with all of the department heads at Nintendo. Iwata would encourage employees to follow their own ideas when they disagreed with his direction, stating, "Creators only improve themselves by taking risk." Satoru Iwata would become president of Nintendo in May of 2002, and would serve as the head of Nintendo during the rest of the GameCube's lifespan. Iwata would become one of the most respected and beloved figures in the video game industry during the 2010s as he hosted Nintendo Direct. Iwata would serve as president of Nintendo until his death in 2015. He was 55. The software drought for the GameCube would come to an end in August of 2002, when the highly anticipated Super Mario Sunshine released to critical acclaim. The title was a follow-up to the beloved Super Mario 64 that had released alongside the Nintendo 64. Despite its differences from previous titles, the game would go on to sell 5 million copies, making it the third best-selling GameCube title ever. Other notable releases at this time included Animal Crossing for North America and The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker in Japan. Sega would port Phantasy Star Online to the GameCube in October, the only online GameCube game to ever be released internationally. In September of 2002, Star Fox Adventures would be released on the GameCube. Originally under the title Dinosaur Planet for the Nintendo 64, Star Fox Adventures would mark a special occasion. It would be the last title Rare would ever release on a Nintendo home console. Rare would become a second-party developer under Nintendo in the mid-90s. The company started making games for Nintendo consoles with the NES, but made their mark with the release of Donkey Kong Country on the Super Nintendo in 1994. For the next 8 years, Rare would become one of Nintendo's most important assets. Rare would create several of their own successful IPs, as well as create some of the best licensed titles of the era. Rare became restless as a second party with Nintendo. In 2001, they began to shop around for a new partner, a company that would purchase 100% of the company. Nintendo seemed like an obvious choice, and had the option to make the first bid on the company. Rare, however, was interested in working with a third-party developer, so they had access to all the current consoles. A bidding war broke out for the company. Activision and Microsoft had both expressed interest in the company and began making offers. Eventually, Activision would withdraw, leaving Microsoft as the sole bidder. Nintendo still had the priority option to purchase the rest of Rare, but Microsoft had raised their bid too high for Nintendo to feasibly consider it. Nintendo would sell their portion of the ownership of Rare for $375 million to Microsoft, making Rare a first-party studio for the tech giant. At the end of the day, it only made sense for Nintendo to sell the company. Rare's production of titles had slowed down during the early days of the GameCube. Nintendo still wanted full ownership of Rare, but the price tag associated with it was just too great. Microsoft would win out in the end, not just by gaining another well-known development studio, but by denying Nintendo one of their key players. With Rare gone, Nintendo turned to their other development studios to continue the effort of quality titles for the Nintendo Gamecube. Luckily for Nintendo, a small studio would become an overnight sensation just a few months later. Retro Studios was founded in 1998 by a group of former acclaimed developers in Austin, Texas. Retro had received funding from Nintendo to create new titles for the GameCube that catered to an adult audience. They were one of the first developers to receive Nintendo GameCube development kits, and would begin work on multiple exclusive titles for the system. Titles would include Raven Blade, an RPG, Thunder Rally, a racing title, NFL Retro Football, a licensed football game, and a project simply known as Action Adventure. All of the titles, excluding Action Adventure, would be cancelled, and Retro's staff would be cut down to compensate. Poor management plagued Retro during their early days. The studio was understaffed for the amount of titles they were working on, and company president Jeff Spangenberg was oftentimes absent during the workday. With the controversy surrounding the studio, Spangenberg would eventually sell Retro Studios to Nintendo in May of 2002 for $1 million. Retro's next task wouldn't be an easy one, though. Metroid had been missing in action for a while. The last title in the series was Super Metroid, which released in 1994. Nintendo never created a Metroid title for the Nintendo 64, citing the difficult task of translating the series to 3D. Retro would transform Action Adventure into Metroid Prime. Not only would it be the first Metroid title in 3D, but it would be the first title in the series to be developed by an American developer. Retro Studios would rush to finish Metroid Prime before its fall 2002 release. Their efforts would pay off when Metroid Prime was released on November 17, 2002, to critical and commercial success. The title would help revitalize the Metroid franchise, and would see 2 additional sequels before being spun off into its own series. Retro would become one of Nintendo's most consistent developers, and the studio continues to make games for Nintendo to this day. Nintendo struggled greatly during its first year on the market with the GameCube. The lack of major software for the system slowed any momentum Nintendo had gained during its launch. The system would rebound later in 2002 thanks to strong first-party titles, but Nintendo's competition knew that blood was in the water. It would take everything in the company's power to make the GameCube a success. This is the third part to a multi-part series covering the story of the Nintendo GameCube. You can support this series by sharing this video on your favorite social media sites. Subscribe to catch the next video when it comes out next week. In the next part, I'll cover the life of the GameCube, ranging from 2003 until early 2005. Thank you for watching.